My name is Lex, and this is my Mecca model. So, I am what I would consider as multi-ethnic. I am one big blend of so many different ethnicities that I often have issues with identifying, which is actually something I'll get into about much later. But via 23andMe and my own family's known history of where we come from, my mother's side is German, Native American, specific to the Cherokee and Lumbee tribes, and African American. Um, so my family, 5 generations prior to me, actually came here from Germany, um, and they were considered white passing blacks. This obviously created some issues throughout much of their social and economical experience here in the United States, which I'll get into as well. But they settled in parts of New York and parts of Pennsylvania. Um, my mother's side of the family is the native side, and they have been here in parts of Pennsylvania and Virginia for a very long time. But with the blend of those two families, there were a lot of participation and excellence, we could say, in education and the arts with the University of Pittsburgh. So my family has a long history of association with the university, which I kind of got shunned for a little bit, not going to, but we'll get into that later. The paternal side of my family is Puerto Rican and Irish. Um, this is something that I struggle with a bit in terms of actually identifying as Latina for a very long time. Only because, for one, my dad and I have a bit of a distant relationship. My parents separated prior to me being born. I did have some relationship with my father growing up, but it was quite limited. It started off mostly as scheduled visitation between him with my brother, and my grandmother actually did most of the caring for us whenever we were over there. Unfortunately, my grandmother passed away when I was 5. She was the one who was really keeping the Spanish heritage alive in our family on my dad's side. And her parents had also passed away. So once she was gone, there really wasn't much continuation of the Spanish culture in my dad's side of the family. We were taught to not speak Spanish outside of the home. So if you can imagine, at 5 years old, not having that encouragement in the home when I was with my dad for those limited times, it caused a lot of language delays for me, which I'll get more into later. Separation wise, so on my mother's side, my great grandfather left to work in New York from Pennsylvania. He lived with, family, and he worked there as a white man. He would send money home to Pennsylvania, to Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. Um, this caused a lot of issues, not only for him but for our family. Again, not being able to identify as your actual race. Um, when he did return home, because of the experience he had working as a white man and then coming home to Pittsburgh eventually and not being able to find a job that was good enough to support his family as a black man, was very difficult. And he developed what they described as schizophrenia, but to this day, what my family believes was just an engorged rage. So he was actually placed in a psychiatric institute. Um, my his son, which is my grandfather, my opa, which is what I call him. He and my grandmother, we use German nicknames for them, Oma and Opa. He also left to join the army whenever he and my grandmother had a year after they had been married. So for a little bit of time, there was some separation there between he and their children. Um, and again, it was difficult for my grandmother being a black woman, and at the time they were living in an area where it was predominantly white. So, there were not only social issues, but also some economical issues. When my grandfather returned home from the army, he um, noticed that my grandmother was not her normal self. In the time of isolation, without him, she had actually developed some severe depression. Um, and with ongoing trauma that she experienced as a child, she became suicidal and was actually hospitalized in the same psychiatric institute that my great grandfather was hospitalized in. And this picture on the right side here is actually what the hospital looked like um, 30, 40 years ago, and then what it looks like to this day. I actually ended up working in this hospital on the unit that um, both of them stayed in. My grandmother was hospitalized 10 different times here. She still struggles with mental health to this day, but she and several other members of my family, including my great grandfather, who died in this hospital, um, had a very big impact on my decision to work in mental health. Other separations particular to me, my father left before I was born, like I mentioned, and we had court ordered visitation. Um, was the court ordered visitation followed properly? Not often. Not on my mother's behalf, but on my father's behalf. It was just a lot of pulling in different directions, and it's definitely impacted me a lot and my relationship with him to this day. Some traumas, mistrust in healthcare. So my great grandfather that was labeled as schizophrenic, which was something that was actually pretty common for Black males to be labeled as opposed to having other forms of disorders, um, or other disorders, or even just noting the fact that maybe he didn't have a mental health diagnosis, but rather he was just angry about his ability to live in this world as a Black man. So my family all, shares pretty much the same concerns, and that they don't really think that he was that ill, mentally ill, to be placed in the psychiatric facility, but he was maintained there up until he died at the age of 55, so quite early. He was also, prior to living or returning to Pittsburgh and, living in New York and working as a white man in New York, he was actually in the military. He was in the army as well, and he was discharged honorably after having an adverse reaction to a vaccine that they had given him. During this time, this was a pretty frequent time where they were actually experimenting on Blacks with different medications. So this experience led to a lot of mistrust in him, which, also was passed down to his children, aka my grandfather, and my aunts and uncles, and even my own parents. So we have a little bit of mistrust in healthcare. Personally, myself and my siblings and my mother, we have moved 13 times um, in from the span of kindergarten to my senior year of high school. I currently still have a really hard time with being fearful of being displaced. Identity issues, as I mentioned, I am multi-ethnic, so for a long time, I really never knew what to call myself. People would look at me and all the time ask me, "What are you?" I still to this day get asked a million different things. Throughout my experience in high school, undergrad, my adult experience now, I currently identify as Afro Latina, um, with still, attributing some of my German heritage and, other heritages, but for the most part, I identify as Afro Latina. And the most recent trauma that I experienced was actually my grandfather, my opa, passed away literally a week before this class started. So it's been something that's been really hard for me to deal with. Ecological niche. So, community, African American, although my mother's side of the family is multi-ethnic, we grew up being known as Blacks in Pittsburgh. So we grew up in an African American community in the Hill District in Pittsburgh. Um, And I was born in 1996, so 90s, 2000s baby. My neighborhood, actually, where I grew up in, is a food desert and has been a food desert for several years. Um, we would have to either take public transportation or take a what you guys would call a taxi, we call it jitney, 5 miles in order to be able to go to the closest grocery store. Um, my neighbors were like family. Everyone in the neighborhood knew who I was. My mother's last name is Jones. So they always knew the Joneses as, a well-educated Black family in our neighborhood, but we treated everybody as if they were a part of our family. Um, in terms of schooling, so I grew up in the inner city of Pittsburgh, like I mentioned, but once I got to before fourth grade started, my mother actually moved us to the suburbs, so that we could have a better education. So when I moved from public school, which was a predominantly Black um, elementary school, I was switched to a predominantly white elementary school, middle school, and high school. Um, Although I had a public school education starting off, I had always been in gifted programs. When I got to the school in the suburbs, I continued that, and I was always in honors or gate programs. Um, which I enjoyed, but it also ended up being, again, something that had me struggle a lot with my identity because there were not a lot of kids that looked like me in those programs. We were actually one of 8 Black families in our neighborhood in the suburbs until 2015. And we were not, what you could say, we never fell in line with the um, like socioeconomic status of those other families or any of the families in my neighborhood. We were considered very poor. Um, I also struggled with my second language, which is Spanish. As I mentioned, my dad didn't really have any motivation to continue teaching me Spanish after my grandmother passed away. So I had a big lapse in my Spanish up until sixth grade, which was when we had the opportunity to pick a language. So I chose Spanish naturally, and I studied Spanish all the way up until my junior year of college. I am now bilingual, fluent. I can read and write proficiently, but it was something that I struggled with a lot, and just being able to connect to people who spoke Spanish. Um, I'm one of, I am the first and only one of my siblings to graduate college, although my grandfather, and great grandparents and uncles all attended university. My mother and her siblings, and as well as none of my siblings, ever decided to go forward with college. I had a lot of pressure on me to perform academically because I was in those honors classes. So yeah. Housing. I moved 13 times because of rent increases growing up. My mother suffers from some pretty serious medical issues. She has relapsing and remitting MS, and she also has rheumatoid arthritis. So it was very hard for her to maintain employment a lot of the times. Well, she did have the strong support from my grandparents. um, there were times where she just couldn't make ends meet. So we were constantly moving back between a house that was out in the suburbs and my grandparents' house. There were times where we had to use a fake address or a friend's address that was out in the area where we were going to school in order to stay enrolled in our school. But my mom did what she had to do to keep us in a good school district and to make sure that we got a good education. But being that I was constantly being moved, I lost a lot of my belongings. Um, if I would have had to present this in person, I literally would have not had anything to really show you guys that comes from my home, because of the simple fact that I don't have a lot of my things anymore. Um, it's something that still bothers me to this day. And moving to New York, um, I was constantly obsessed with making sure I kept every little tiny thing I could now that I live on my own. But I've since, gotten better with some of those feelings. Um, Sharing everything. I have 8 siblings, which I'll talk about more, but no matter where we were, because most of the time we were in a house that was not really big enough for all of us because of the money issues my mother had. I was forced to share everything, especially because my sister and I are the only two girls, so it was up to us to make do with what we had. I left Pittsburgh in December of 2016, and I moved here to New York. I've been living here for 8 years now. In working now, I always look like the minority, and for the most of the time, I feel like I have been able to resonate with minorities, especially considering that I am multi-ethnic. Um, there have been language barriers for me in terms of sometimes, like I said, although I am fluent in Spanish now, growing up, I struggled with my Spanish. So when I was presented with the opportunity to interact with someone who was of a similar culture as me, it was very difficult for me. Um, in working, I think I mentioned before that I had the opportunity to work in the Psychiatric Institute where both my great grandfather and my grandmother um, were both hospitalized multiple times. This connection just allowed me to have a better understanding of mental health and really step away from my family's mistrust in mental health and the medical field. Um, and even in those situations, I was exposed to, you know, working with people that I knew often and people that were close to me that would come into the hospital. There were definitely times where obviously I had to remove myself from participating in treatment, but it was quite often that there were people that I knew in my hometown that would show up where I worked. I have a lot of family members, especially my father, who struggle with substance use. And so, with the combination of the mental health history that my family has and with the substance use, it led me down the path to get my CASAC certification. And I have been working in addiction for almost 4 years now. Um, Community. As I mentioned, I'm Afro Latina, identify as Afro Latina. I've been living here in New York for 8 years. Um, my family has always been blended and it's been continuing to extend in that manner. And my family is now so less focused on the educational part of um, life. I mean, they value education, but it's more so encouraging us to be passionate about what we like or finding something rather that is your passion. Okay, so as I mentioned, I am one of nine. I have eight siblings, five biological. So my mother has four biological children. I am the second of the four. She has a stepson and two adopted sons, and then my father has two boys, younger than me. So I have two sets of parents. I have my father, who is now divorced, my mother, who is on the way to be divorced, but growing up, I had a stepfather and I had a stepmother, and then my maternal grandparents. So that's pretty much what my close family structure was. But it was very much also involving extended family members. I have tons and tons of aunts and uncles and cousins, both biological and non biological, and neighborhood kids. So my two adopted siblings were actually children in the suburbs that are also um, Black children that were, I guess you could say, they were just like stoop kids that were in the neighborhood that weren't really being taken care of by their parents. And my mother has an open door policy, so we took them in. She legally adopted both of them um, whenever they were in high school. My family is very big on connectedness, so we are always getting together for family meals, despite not always having, or being in the greatest financial position. My mom always made sure that food was something that we had to look forward to, even if it couldn't be material things. So we're very big on holidays with getting together to eat. It's not necessarily about anything else. Um, Hanging out on the porch. My porch has always been the forefront of my social life growing up. So, as I mentioned, my mom loved to have us all together under one roof, and she had a lot of fear about letting us. go over other people's houses just because, as a mom, it wasn't too much of a helicopter, but she just wanted to make sure we were safe. So she always encouraged people to come out and hang with us at our house. So um, my porch was always full with kids. If there was an event where we were outside or we were sleeping over someone else's house, my mom always made it a habit to sleep on the couch. She would never sleep in her room if one of us was not home. And it was mandatory that we texted her pretty frequently throughout the night, and throughout the day if we weren't home. And she's still like that to this day, even though I live miles and miles away from her. So my family structure in terms of hierarchies, my grandfather, my opa, who recently passed away, had always been the um, head of our family. But in his passing, it's actually transitioned over to my mom, um, which doesn't surprise me because she has always been strong in that way, and my grandfather raised her to be sort of what we call the matriarch. So my mother always called our house a queendom, not a kingdom, despite the fact that she was previously married. Um, what she said always goes. We had a lot of non-traditional gender roles. All of my siblings learned how to cook. We learned how to clean. My mother made sure that my sister and I knew how to change a tire. We could do, different jobs around the house. Plumbing wise, electrical, like whatever you name it. So to this day, with my own partner, like I'm the one who's the handyman in the house. He is not. So, yeah, we had non-traditional gender roles, but it just encouraged us to be extremely independent. And education equals power. So as I mentioned, my family is very big. Ties to the University of Pittsburgh because of my great grandparents and great aunts and uncles and grandfathers' participation in their university with, programs that have to do with academics, but then also the arts. So to them, getting a college degree was like non-negotiable for a very long time. As I mentioned, my siblings kind of rebelled on that end, and so did my mother and her siblings. So I am thus far the only one that is, I guess you could say, maintaining that value for them. Communication styles, very expressive. We love to get loud when we're talking, especially because we're all very passionate people. But it is orderly. Everyone has to be respectful, especially of elders, but you know, family, we never are, we can get mean with each other, but we always make up, I guess you could say. But staying out of grown folks' business. As a child, I was always told to kind of be a little bit more reserved with what I said. It wasn't until I got much older that I was allowed to be expressive um, to adults, if that makes sense. Family life cycle. So, as I mentioned, education, there's always something more to learn. And I still hold those strong values. It's just my family doesn't necessarily believe that it has to be college education in terms of learning. I have siblings now who are learning at the level of vocational schools and trades, and even just more art like professions or things that are just not so, like, I guess you could say, statistically structured. Family comes first, known to drop everything and go if something is going on. Despite the fact that I live here, I do travel home pretty often to try and be as involved in, my siblings' lives um, as much as I possibly can. An open door policy. Still to this day, my mother does not have an empty nest. So I moved out, as I mentioned, in 2016, but my siblings also attempted to move out, but eventually all ended up moving back into the house with my mother and my grandmother. So we all still share one residence in our neighborhood, my grandparents' home that we all occasionally go back to from here and there. But my mother also is still adopting random neighborhood children, not legally, but just allowing people to stay with her whenever, they need something. And these people have ended up becoming close friends of our family. Maintaining our roots and planting new roots. So, as I mentioned, our house that we have in the Hill District has been in our family since my great great grandparents have been here. And the goal is to keep it that way. It's the one thing that we have that we own. So it's important for us to keep our roots there. Hopefully, the house will continue to be passed down in our generations. My mother currently occupies um, the home legally. I am planting new roots now that I've moved here. I hope to eventually buy my own house, and have that sense of stability with housing, and the traumas that I have of being at times homeless. Um, Meetings, collectivism. So, we're all about, doing what's best for our group, for the majority of us, and achieving success in that way. We're all helping hands with one another if one another needs something, whether it's financially or, emotionally supportive. Just, having goals that benefit us all. Timing. Like I said, adjusting living situations to fulfill family needs. So there were times where, even in those 13 times when I moved, where I may have stayed and lived with my grandparents for a portion of time, while maybe some of my younger siblings lived in the actual house in the suburbs because there just wasn't enough space. And being older, I felt like it was easier for me to get up and travel to go to school out there than it would have been for them. So I made the commute for them a little bit shorter, being that they were living closer. Also, I moved in with my grandparents directly after I graduated high school again, because I ended up taking care of my grandfather when he became sick. So moving here to New York was actually really difficult for me because he was still ill. But my younger siblings actually took over that responsibility and moved in shortly after I left. Um, so, in supporting my grandparents through their medical and mental health needs, my grandmother with her mental health, still to this day, I am her, what we call her little family therapist. She pretty much only discloses anything in regards to her mental health to me, which is a little difficult because I live here. But I still to this day am doing my best to be her support. And up until my grandfather's death, I was again mainly in charge of assisting with his care. He trusted me knowing that I have some history in working in the mental health field and with some medical things. So he was able to put some trust in me when it came to working with medical professionals. So I was able to kind of bridge that gap for them. And I actually, because I had built such a strong bond with him, I was in charge of making his funeral arrangements this past January, um, which was traumatizing in a sense, but it helped me grow and helped me be who I am now. And I just have a very different outlook on the life cycle and just family in general. It made my family stronger. Transition. So me leaving the nest has always been a transition. Like I said, I'm the only one that does not live in Pittsburgh, the only one that is not home. So that has been difficult for them. Um, and just starting our own families and new traditions. Now that I do live here, there are times where I stay here for the holidays because I am working on, setting traditions with my own partner. So, it's been a little bit of adjustment for my mom to not have me home for a big meal at times. And my sister actually recently had um, the second baby in the family. Her name is Amara. She's in these pictures here. The gentleman in these pictures is actually my grandfather who passed away. Um, so connecting the old traditions we have with the new traditions that we have with her. And as I mentioned, deaths. There have been a lot of deaths, I would say, since I was in high school, of close friends and close family members, to mental health, suicide, and particularly substance use as well, and overdoses, and then in just general medical and old age. So, my current values, I would say family obviously is number one for me. It always has been, it always will be. My family that I grew up with, and the current family that I'm developing now, which is my boyfriend who's in those pictures with me, and my three puppies, which you see there. Opportunity is a big one for me. And I chose opportunity because while again, I still do have a strong belief in education, um, I I think my family's model and my model of what that means is also in regards to experiences. So being able to travel, being able to move, being able to experience the world, which I have been able to do. I've traveled to Thailand, I've traveled to Costa Rica, I've been to Hawaii. So there's some pictures there of the opportunities that I had to do that. Resilience. I am a very big advocate for people of color, for minorities, for women. Um, and with a lot of the things that I've experienced as a child in terms of, you know, being the minority in big settings and in small settings, being a woman, being um, homeless at times. I just believe in always pushing forward and, being able to make the most out of every situation. I often participate in a lot of activism. I do have a picture here of um, a protest that I sat in during the Black Lives Matter protest and movement. Courage, being afraid to, or being not being afraid to take big risks. It was a big risk for me moving here, a big risk for me to tell my family that I was going into the mental health field despite their concerns with, um, you know, mental health and medical um, professions. And loyalty. I think this just ties back into family and my mom's open door policy, being loyal to those who love you and those who support you and care for you, and also helping others and always just extending that olive branch and making, a bridge to people for a better experience. Yeah, so that's me. This was long, so I'm sorry, but I think that all my experiences now, just again, as I mentioned, being able to connect with my clients with homelessness, with being different, with being mistrustful of certain circumstances and whether or not these sorts of treatments or settings really work. And if people have the best intentions. So I feel like I can relate a lot with my clients on that matter. Um, and just especially in the resilience sector, like encouraging people that, they can overcome things and yeah, so that's me.